photographing houses and hotels and that kind of thing. And travel photography is similar but different. You know, you use a lot of the same skills as far as operating your camera, looking for light, but they're just different situational skills. So I had to become aware of thinking before I went out taking those photos about what am I actually doing here? Why do I want to make these photos? What kind of photos do I want to come home with? And then once I got out there, the next challenge was actually choosing my subject. So like the photo that's behind this, this graphic here, that's marketed in Marrakesh. And it's very easy to stand back and take a big wide photo that's satisfying because I was there. I remember what that felt like in the moment. But anybody else looking at that scene might just say, well, there's no point of interest. What do you want me to look at? What are you trying to tell me about this? Because I'm not pointing your eye to anything. So that's choosing your subject, picking out the story that you want to tell the people, or what impact you want this photo to have on somebody. And then we'll get into some just practical tips for actually making stronger photos, some things that you can use, just kind of write down a bullet point list and go through when you're actually thinking about making those photos. And then finally, what happens with those photos after I come home? What do I do with them? What should you do with them? Or what might you think about doing with them? And how does that lend itself to helping with future travels that you might take? So number one, this matters to me because that first trip that I took by myself when I was just practicing my photography, I didn't know that I was just learning my photography, my travel photography. I had been, like I said, in the studio just shooting products. So I took a little point and shoot. I wasn't even thinking about capturing good photos on this trip. I was just thinking, I'm going to make some snapshots of the places that I see, which is normally how we go about our travel photography. We're just thinking, oh, I'm going to throw the camera in my bag. Whatever happens, happens. I'll just point it at whatever happens and come home with some things to remember my trip by. And that's really what this trip was for me. And when I got back home, I shared these photos with another friend of mine. He likes to travel a lot as well. We sat down over lunch and he said, I come home with all these snapshots of my trips, but I don't really remember anything that vividly. I don't even know why I was there. It's not like I'm really paying attention. I'm just kind of going through the motions because, well, I got to have something to put up on Facebook. Otherwise, nobody's going to believe I was there, right? Yep, I know that feeling. That's happened to me too. So out of that trip, I went to several stops in China, and then I went across the border into Vietnam and took a whole bunch of photos, but these were the only ones. This like dozen or so here are the ones that I came home with that I felt like were actually worth helping me remember the trip. And I was really frustrated because I thought, well, I'm a photographer, right? I know how to make a good photo in a studio under perfect conditions. What's wrong with me? Why couldn't I get better photos when I was out on my trips? And that's really what leads me to coming across with these topics. And so the next part of this is really my journey from there, which was 2011. I think when I first took my travels and started practicing my photography outside of a controlled condition in a studio where I controlled, the environment and the lights and the people and the camera and everything, to just, really getting into why am I doing this and what do I want to come home with? And the number one reason, of course, why do we make these travel photos is to deepen our travel experience. Just get us out there beyond the tourist sites and give us a reason to dig a little bit deeper and pay attention, quite frankly, when we travel, rather than just taking the formulaic, this is my lunch and this is the hotel I stayed at and this is the cab that took me there. What else is there? And really, if we're not paying attention to the things outside of that tourist experience, why did we even go there? Why do we even take the effort to get on a plane and go to a different country? Anyway, and then the next step would be doing coverage. And this is something that took me a while to understand and develop, even going out with other photographers, learning from them. And then when I started to try and sell my services to say, hey, I can write an article, I can put together a project for you, I quickly learned that just coming home with one good photo doesn't really cut it. You've got to tell a story. And sometimes you can do that with one photo, but a lot of times it's best to do that in a series of photos. So you could think of this as if you're writing an article, or let's say you're putting together your family newsletter to go out to your mailing list at Christmas. If you're going to tell a story, what are you going to tell everybody about that place that you went? And then how can you illustrate that with a series of photos? So that's the way to think about coverage. We're going to start wide, and then we're going to drill down to the details and try and add a little bit of everything in between. And then what I do mostly now when I travel, I'm just looking for artistic frames. I try not to work on projects anymore and try to sell those services. I'm strictly looking for something just for myself, to make myself happy, to remember that situation, but at a different level than what I did on that first trip, where I just took my point and shoot, and my little iPhone 4 at the time is what I had with me. So I've upgraded my camera gear, and I intentionally go to places for the purpose of making an artistic frame. So just want to share a few stories from some of each of those categories. And number one, we photographed to deepen our travel experience. This one that we're looking at, this is Roatan, Honduras. It is just off the coast of Honduras, and it's kind of a resort area, but it's pretty inexpensive. I went here with my wife for honeymoon because I'm cheap, and I like the cultural travel experience, and it's a great spot to go diving too. But I got there the day before her, and I was out looking for just some interesting things, like I said, beyond just the tourist experience. And I came across this scene where late at night, this was a convenience store that was still open, and this is outside of the tourist area. So I just walked down the street, tried to conceal myself in the shadows so nobody would know I was there. And I just set up my camera, put my settings on, and I just kind of waited for something to happen, waited for an interesting scene to unfold. And that's as soon as I see this scene, this takes me right back there, helps me to remember what the place smelled like, felt like. It just gives me a sense of, yeah, this is where I was, and this is Honduras to me. This reminds me of that trip very clearly. This is in the south of Morocco, just outside of the dunes that most people go to make artistic images. We had camped in the dunes the night before, and our guide took us out of the dunes. You don't want to be in the dunes during the day because it gets ridiculously hot. And I said, well, I don't have a plan. What are we going to do for the day? Just show me something. Show me something interesting. Where would you go if you were here? And this guide that I was with, he grew up in the area, so he kind of knows the towns and where people live and migrate to. So he drove way out in the middle of nowhere, and I had no idea where he was going. It was just all this empty wasteland. And then he pulls up next to these little huts, and there was this nomad family that came out, and they knew him, and he introduced us. He gave us access to something that we wouldn't have had access to if I just said, take us to a hotel. We want to be comfortable for the day. We just want to sit and have drinks. I wanted to seek out something to make an interesting photo of, and I wanted a cultural experience. So that photography took me to a place that I never would have tried to visit otherwise. And this family, because we were there with somebody that they knew, they were comfortable, and they let me and the couple friends I was with just wander around and take photos at their place. So, again, one of those experiences that I wouldn't have been able to have if I hadn't been seeking out images when I was, practicing my travels. Excuse me, grab a drink here. I don't see any questions in the chat there, so I'll keep rambling. This scene in particular, my wife used to be on the board for Project Cure, and they gather medical equipment and supplies and devices from hospitals and then take them to third world countries. And I had signed up for this trip and asked if I could be the group's photographer. Plus, I'm not a medical personnel, but I said, I can carry heavy things. I'll set up tents, I'll carry bags, whatever you need. So I volunteered my way onto this trip. And this is still at the very early stages of practicing my photography on my travels. I didn't know what I was doing, but I talked my way into going as their photographer for the group. And at this session, we had to meet all of the area chiefs in order to get their blessing to go out and service their villages and meet their people. And as my group was done shaking hands and giving gifts and filing out, the chief up there in the middle, he stopped me and universal gesture for taking my picture. He stopped me and asked me to take his photo. And then he got all the other chiefs around him and asked me to take their photo. And I didn't have even a good camera at the time. Like I said, I was not real experienced. Now I think I can make a little bit better image of this, but really, I don't care. It's one of those images that again just transports me back to that memory and that place. You know, I could have shot this with an iPhone and been perfectly happy. And quite frankly, what made me happy about this was not even just taking the picture. You know, having access to this type of a scene. As I was walking out, somebody else handed me their email address because these guys, you can see them. Some of them are sitting there with cell phones in their hands. They gave me an email address, so I emailed the photo back to them. So I know they were able to see this picture, which makes it extra special for me. All right. So the next reason that we practice our photography, and you know, not everybody's going to do this, but if you want to take it to the next stage and think about leveling up your photography, I guess, or if you do want to put together longer form stories or articles or sell your work, then you might have to think about doing coverage when you go to a place. So this was from Cuba. When I went to Cuba, I wrote down about half this list before I got there, and then the rest of the list kind of filled itself in as I went. So I have an idea in mind when I get there. I'm looking for a shot list that will fill in sort of these sort of storylines. And what I'm talking about here today is the tobacco houses. So this is one story that I picked out to work on specifically. So start with the wide shot of this is the tobacco farm. This is where they start the process. And then they take the tobacco into the tobacco house after they grow it. And then everybody strings up those tobacco leaves and hangs them up there in the roof of the tobacco house to dry. Unless, of course, they're on lunch break and they're just not paying attention to anybody. So again, this is a place that somebody introduced me to. I was there with somebody that they knew. So I had access to go in, take their photos. And that's something I'll make, especially about this kind of travel photography. It's never polite to just go shove a camera in somebody's face. I see that even here at home. Like a lot of times when I'm out with friends on a bike ride, I'll pull out my camera to take photos, and some of them just don't like to be on camera. They'll say, can you not include me in that photo? So it's not just a cultural thing. It's sort of a personal preference, but there are some cultures more than others that say, I don't want to be on camera. Please don't take my photo. So that's why I usually go with a guide who gets me access to these type of places and gets me invited in, so they know that I'm a friend. I'm not going to do anything nefarious with the photos, if you will. And then at the end of that day, Armando here grabbed some of the tobacco leaves out of the tobacco house, took me out and rolled some cigars, and we sat there and we smoked a couple of cigars together. And they, a lot of them will take these little bundles of cigars and sell them at their local shops as well. So some of it goes to the markets in the US, some of it just stays local. So I did this whole bit on just the tobacco houses, and I've got, a few hundred more photos, but these were the ones that I used to illustrate that specific story about the process of, growing the tobacco locally and then keeping it local too. I wasn't doing a story for exporting or for any kind of an external publication. This is for something local in Cuba. All right. And then my personal favorite, why I make photos now, is to capture artistic images. And the reason I'm going through this is these were not ideas that were in my head at all when I first started traveling. I wasn't thinking about, I'm going to use my photography to get me access to these places. I'm not going to use photography to set up a shot and to really think through a scene and to be the reason even that I go visit some places, but now I do. So the photography kind of leads my travels now. I go to places specifically with the intent in mind to add a photo to my portfolio, or get a certain kind of experience or learn something with my photography. So this one here, again in Morocco, I knew I wanted to capture some photos of the camels on the dunes. You'd see classic camels in the sunlight and with long shadows. And I asked our guy here who was taking us into the desert camp, I said, how do I get one of those photos? And he said, 50 years ago, you could just walk anywhere and get a picture like that. But now they're all staged because there's so many tourists here. I said, all right, that's fine. We can stage a photo. What do I have to do? And he said, well, meet me out here at 6 in the morning. So I got up at 6 in the morning, just before the sun came up. And he said, well, do you want the saddles on the camels, or do you want them all naked? Well, I'd like them like him naked. He starts to take the saddles off. He goes, okay, it's going to take me another hour. So, don't bother. Just leave the saddles on. I don't care that much. So he just went out there and he walked around with his camels for about an hour. And me and the folks I was with, we got a chance to take several images. I could go through a whole bunch here, but those are a couple that I really liked from that scene. I didn't get kind of the classic, maybe aerial or long shadows photo that I was looking for, but I was pretty happy with the way it turned out. And I, knowing what I know now, I wouldn't have been able to capture that kind of a photo just wandering out there on my own. I had to do a little bit of thought process to set it up and get in the right place and get somebody to help me with it. I might have been able to get lucky, just taking photos of some other people, setting up that kind of shot for themselves. But it's always best if you know that's a shot that you want to come home with, that you put the things in place to make it happen, I guess, is the best way to say that. This one, I was with my wife at Magnolia Plantations in South Carolina, and we knew we only had about 3 hours there, and it's a pretty big place. You could easily get lost there. So for about 2 hours, we walked around together, enjoyed all of the gardens and the swamps there, and I had just kind of kept my eyes open to see what the light was doing and some of those spots that I might want to go back to and take a picture. And it's never polite when you're with your family or with friends on a trip to say, hey, I really want to stop here and take a picture, because they know, you as a photographer, you're probably going to be sitting there for an hour. They don't want to wait for you. So when we were about ready to leave, I told my wife, I said, I really want to go back and get a picture. Can you meet me at the entrance? I'll be like 45 minutes. And I went back and I got this photo and a few other scenes. So it doesn't always have to be planned in advance, but it does have to be something that you premeditate if you really want to make a good image somewhere a lot of times, because you're rarely going to be just walking through someplace and the timing is right, the light is just right. Sometimes you do have to sit and wait a little while. So, sometimes you can do it when you're on your travels with other people. They don't usually fall into place like that, though. And then this one is on the south shore of Java, Indonesia. Again, I was with somebody who was taking me to a beach. We were going to a turtle hatchery where I was supposed to be putting together a story. And he said, oh, we're not going to get there before sunset anyway. You got to go see this locals beach. I'm like, all right, go ahead. Let's go. Let's go check it out. So he drives me through the jungle. We get on one of those long boats that's there behind us and go around the bend, and it's like an hour boat ride to get over to this beach. And as soon as I got off, I'm the white tourist guy there. Everybody wants to take a picture with the white tourist guy. Like, I'm the oddity there. So of course I got my snapshot photo, but I didn't go to this place specifically to make an artistic image, but at the same time, I'm not going to waste the opportunity. So I wandered down the beach, found something that to me, speaks to my soul. So when I go back paging through my photos, I definitely remember this scene, all of these guys mobbing me and asking to take a picture with the weird white guy that's there. But what makes me really smile to remember this is a scene like this, where I took my time to walk around the scene, and I gathered, of course, a bunch more photos, but this is the one that really stood out to me. And they have a name for this tree. I can't remember what it is, but this is some sort of legendary tree there on the South Island of Java. So I really wanted to make sure that was kind of the focal point of my image. All right, I still don't see any questions in the chat. Anybody have anything? No hecklers tonight. Kind of surprised. Or everybody's already dropped off. No, I still see people in there. All right, we'll keep on trucking there. Okay. So the next challenge, after you've decided, okay, what kind of photos do I want to make on my trip? You come into a scene like these two situations I want to show you here, and it's hard to know, what am I actually going to make a picture of? What would make a strong image in this situation? So we're going to talk about Mount Egan, volcano and sulfur mine, and then the tannery in Fez, Morocco. So the first one is this giant crater sulfur mine in Indonesia. And when you first come up to the top of the crater and look over, I mean, it's pretty impactful, especially standing there, because you can smell the sulfur gases coming up out of the volcano, and it's just an impressive scene. You look at that, you look down at that and go, wow, I've never been anywhere like this. This is totally unique. But how do I transfer that into a photograph? And that's the hard part. So I already knew when I got here, I was going to do coverage, which means I'm going to get my wide shot, and then I'm going to drill down to the little details to tell a little bit more of the story. So as I walked down into the volcano, I was looking for those story kind of moments. Like, what is this place really? Who comes here? Wow, it's full of local tourists. So I've got to get a few photos of that. And then you actually hike down into this volcano at 4 in the morning. Why, I don't know, but that's when everybody goes. That's the best time to get there. So you hike down in at 4 in the morning. So you get down to the bottom when it's still pitch black. And I didn't do a great job of capturing this photo. It's a little grainy and muddy, but you can see up here the fires coming out of the volcano, and then the guys down here digging the sulfur out of the vents where it forms on the side of the volcano. So that was next. I was kind of gathering those little bits and pieces that tell me a little bit more about what is this place, who are the people here, and then they load those chunks of sulfur up into these baskets, and then they carry them up out of the volcano. And they can make 7 or 8 trips up out of the volcano with a basket full of these sulfur bricks, and those 2 baskets together can weigh a couple hundred pounds. So these guys are doing some pretty hard work, and I'm a photographer just hanging out there, just snapping photos. They're kind of used to tourists there. They didn't seem to pay any mind to everybody else that was hanging around there. So I had the flexibility and the leisure to capture what I wanted. And the only way that I came away with any good photos at all here was because I knew what I wanted out of the scene. I knew that I would have to gather everything from the wide shot that we started with all the way down through the little details in order to tell the story of what is this place like. And that allowed me to pick out and focus on what do I need to actually fulfill that shot list. So in that sense, it made it a little bit easy because I knew the outcome that I needed from photographing there. The next one is the tannery in Fez, Morocco. This is a place that I've been to twice now, and each time they'll usher you into a different balcony, just depending on kind of which street you come in on. If you've been to Morocco, it's kind of it's not a normal street layout. You can easily get lost there. So they'll just take you into whichever side of the building you come in on, so you have a different view. And again, this is one of those places that's totally unique. So just a snapshot, just showing you, hey, this is what it looks like. I've been here. That's kind of interesting, but there's no point of interest. I'm not telling a story. Neither of these are strong images. I'm not accomplishing anything by showing you this other than, hey, this is what it looks like. What do you do? So the next thing is to decide, am I going to make an artistic image here? Am I going to try and tell a story here? Well, I don't have access to get down on the floor and talk to these guys that are working there. Really, what would I do with a story about this place? It's been written about tons of times. So, I'm going to try and find some interesting artistic images. So I start to work with my compositional skills. Okay, looking for light, colors, lines, shapes. And you can find that in pretty much anything, even midday. I don't love shooting in midday sunlight because it's pretty harsh, but at the same time, you can find interesting lines and shapes just in your subject matter and not worry so much about the light. And then I paid a little bit closer attention to what was going on down on the floor, and I found these 2 unique scenes where I could focus specifically on one person doing something. The guy there on the left, this guy kept walking across that vat of red dye with his red shoes, and the color just caught my attention. So I spent a few minutes focusing on him, trying to make an image of him, seeing if he would slip into the vat of red dye there. And then the guy on the right, this is what they do there. They basically take the leathers, they dip them into all of these different vats to break them down and dye them by different colors. So I wanted to focus on that and get one good photo at least of somebody doing the job that they do there. And then I cropped this down the first time just to the guy here and left these sandals out up here. And then I came back and I re-edited this because I like the layers. So you got the bright area down here, and then the dark shadowy area up here, and then the bright sandals up there obviously kind of grab your attention. So your eyes start here on the bright part of the photo and then go, oh, hey, what's up there? There's something interesting, and then come right back to the bright area of the photo. But I felt like it had more layers with that extra color up there. All right, and then this is my last section, and then I've got some closing remarks, but I think we're doing okay on time here. So a few tips for just making stronger photos. And these are things that nobody taught me when I first started photography. You know, everybody that you work with, or my mentors anyway, that taught me photography was all about learn to use the camera, learn how to use your shutter speed, and learn how to use your lights, because I was doing a lot of off-camera flash and lights at the time. So that's what everybody focused on, the mechanics of how to operate your gear. And then you get out in the real world and realize, well, I don't really have control over the situation, so what can I do to actually make a strong image here? And then the best place that I found was look at the art world. And I've gathered these tips through a lot of different people that I've learned from over the years and worked with, and my own experience. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but this I kind of cover in depth in one of those free videos that's on the website if you want to download that one. So just some tips here that you can use immediately for any photo that you make. Number one thing that everybody's eyes are drawn to is the brightest point in the image. And even if you go look at black and whites, especially classic black and white photographers, Ansel Adams for landscape focuses the brightest point of the image on whatever his subject is. And he did a lot of dodging and burning and post-processing on his photos. As you can tell, that's kind of my style too. I like to post-process my images. This isn't straight out of the camera this way, but it works whether you're doing edits to your photos or you like your photos completely au naturel, untouched. This has to do with how you compose your photos and where you look to place that brightest point in the image. And then the shadows over here give it that depth. So your eyes immediately go to the brightest point, and then they go to the darkest point, and that's your eyes' way of figuring out where the depth is in the scene. This is farthest from me, or this is closest to me, that's farthest from me. And then likewise, the leading lines here. But really the point of this image in itself is just that brightest point in the image draws your eyes in, tells you right where I want you to look. The next one would be the sharpest point in the image. So after the brightest point, your eyes go to the sharpest pixels in the image. That's your brain's way again of saying, oh, this is what they want me to look at. This must be important information. And we do this usually by way of a big f-stop. So f 1.4 to f 6.3, depending on your lens and the scene, is the way that you would do that mechanically with your camera. On the bottom left there, that's a cab in Havana, Cuba. I had been practicing this for a little bit, and I finally got one of these cars driving past me where I was panning my camera at the same speed as the car moving past me, and I was focusing on the front of the car. And obviously the point of doing that is, hey, I want you to look at the car and not the background, because there was a bright building behind it. I didn't want your eyes to go up to the bright points in the building. I wanted your eyes to pay attention to the sharpest point of the image, which is on the car. On the right side, the guy carving the molding there, excuse me, this is a shop in, I don't know, somewhere in Morocco that I went into, and immediately the guy didn't want me to take his photo. This is one of those cultures where they shy away from cameras. And I just walked around the shop for a little bit, and I put my camera down, and I was watching what he was working on. He was carving this wood, and I looked at him, made eye contact, and then I pulled out my camera and pointed it just right at his hands, right at the piece of wood. And he looked at me and nodded and smiled, like, yeah, that's okay, you can take that photo. So I took a few photos and then showed it to him on the back of my camera, and he was really happy. He thought it was just fantastic. So he was happy to have me take those photos of his handicraft, what he was working on, but he didn't want to be the focus of the image. So I did that by using a shallow depth of field, drawing attention to, hey, look at the bright point of the image here plus the sharpest pixels, and then I'll blur everything else to give some context and to honor the wishes of the shop owner there who didn't want to be really a part of the photo. This one I've got an edit on. This one is the most color contrast in the image. This is another thing that you can do, usually by separating the lights and the darks, or by looking for vibrant colors in a scene, which could be anything like those red shoes at the tannery in Morocco or in Fez, anything like a blue sky, bright colors on a building, that gives you that high color contrast. When you don't have that, this is kind of a flat scene to begin with. There's not a lot of color contrast in it. Everything is kind of a mid-tone, which just means a mid-level gray, green, yellow. There's no real point of interest here. And I kind of composed it in an interesting way, I guess, by framing that hut up there in the background with trees. But the way that I drew this out was to do an edit where I make this the brightest point in the image, as well as add a lot of color contrast. And then these rocks down here also become a leading line to draw your eyes up into the image. So not something you can really do in camera in this scene, but this is where I say, look for those points of color contrast where you've got some brights and some bright and sharp colors as contrasted with, let's say, the way I edited this with all of the darks out here on the edge. And the reason that you do this sort of an edit is to say, I added dark pixels out here to keep your eyes from going there. Basically, you want people's eyes to go to the bright point of the image, which should be right on your main subject, and then you add dark pixels around it to keep people's eyes from sliding off the image, which is a total photographer term, but that's just to keep people's eyes interested in what you want them to look at. And this is not on that list of 5 bullet points, but this is equally as important. Kind of goes back to drawing attention to the brightest point in the image. And this means, or alternating lights and darks just is another way of creating some depth in a landscape, of creating that sense of, hey, this is a 2D image, but your mind can translate that into the 3D real world because there's some depth of color. So we start with a dark layer of pixels down here, then the bright on the top of the hill, then another dark layer, brights, and then darks again at the top of the image. And that alternating darks and lights pulls your eye through the image and creates that sense of depth and space in the real world. All right, the final item here on directing viewer attention. This is something that took me a while to really get my head around as a photographer, and this is really the difference between taking a snapshot and making a photograph. Again, another total photographer term there, I realize, but I'll illustrate what I mean by that. So I walked past the scene, I pulled my camera up and just took a shot because there's something interesting there. I know there's something interesting there, but what do I do with that scene now? And I took several photos standing here, and then I decided when I got back home to edit it down, and I hadn't even been planning on this, but these 3 birds just happened to be in just the right spot. Total luck on my part, but that happened to work out really well for me. So I took out some extra information here on the edges of the frame because I didn't feel like that really added anything to the story. And then obviously I photoshopped out the power lines going across the sky here just to take that distraction away as well, because I don't want you looking up there. I want you looking down here at the boats. But those 3 birds are positioned real nicely. So how do I use that? So I went ahead and did one more crop to get it down to just the 3 boats there in the front. And obviously you can tell there's still a lot of boats there in the background. I'm not really losing any information. And I feel like that's a much stronger photo than where I had started, because here your eyes don't know where to look. There's just too much going on. There's too much noise and busyness. And photography is the art of subtraction. Whereas when you're painting or sketching or drawing, you continue adding information until you get to telling the story, creating the scene that you want to create. With photography, we start with all the pixels, all the information. There's too much information. So what do you actually want me to look at? Well, let's take away some information. Is it a little more clear? Okay, let's take away some more information. All right, now I know what was interesting about the scene when I stopped to photograph it. So that's what I mean by removing distractions. Don't be afraid to throw a bunch of pixels away, and you don't necessarily even have to do that by having a fancy long zoom lens. You can always edit it later. I don't know why I left this slide in here. This is just the page on my website where you can go and get the free download stuff there if you're interested. And before I wrap up here though, I did want to make this last point for you. What do you do with the photos when you come home? And this is a little overkill. Most people aren't going to do this. I've got a Smug Mug album for this. Smug Mug last year just bought Flickr, which has been around forever. I encourage you to do something with your pictures rather than just leave them on a hard drive. If that means that you just share them on Facebook, okay. But I would encourage you to put them together in some sort of a way where you can see them all together from either that trip or from multiple trips. And what this does for me now, when I go back and I look through this, I get a sense of my evolution as a photographer, I guess. Where have I been? What's my style? What am I going for? When I take my next trip, do I want to photograph in the same style? Do I want to make pictures of the same things? Do I want to capture new things? So being able to review them all in a kind of photo album sort of style gets your brain thinking about, when I go on my next trip, what do I want to do with all of these things? And it doesn't have to be anything fancy. You can use something free like Flickr, like a Google Photos. And that takes us right back to where we started, which is, come on, Google Slides. Which is right back to the idea here of what kind of photos do you want to make? And now when I go on a trip, I don't leave, or I don't even plan a trip without thinking this through a little bit. So photography is no longer an afterthought. Like, I'm going to get there, I'll just pull the camera out of my suitcase and, we'll see what I get. I'm purposefully thinking about, I'm going to be here on this day and I know there's going to be something interesting happening, or I'm going to try and get these photos to tell a story. And it doesn't even have to be something that I publish anymore. I'm just doing it to make interesting photos for myself. Sometimes I sell them, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I frame and hang them in my home. Sometimes I just enjoy them in my online galleries. But yeah, that's everything I wanted to share today. And hopefully that's got you thinking about the kind of the photographer's process, I guess. How to make that transition from I'm just taking snapshots now to what do I need to consider if I want to maybe just up my photography game a little bit and come home with better photos. Valerie, are you still there?
I am. Yeah. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, we got a little thank you in the chat from David. All right. Well,
Anna, are you trying to, I don't know if she's trying to unmute and say something, or? Oh, she's just typing that.
Oh, she's typing. Yes. So thanks, David. This was very helpful, and I love your photos.
Well, we've got a few more minutes. Like, what kind of travel photography do you guys practice? There's only a few of us here. Anybody want to share?
I'm horrible. I just use my cell phone.
All of this applies to the cell phone too. I mean, you can use the same things.
I actually have a camera. My family laughs at me because they say I take the worst pictures ever. I don't know. They mean something to me. And so I try to put them into like photo albums when I'm done so that I can go back and look at them. Even if it is a touristy place, I try to find something to photograph that's different. And then I have my sister as my traveling partner. So very often for Christmas, she gets a photo album of the trip that we took together. And she's always grateful for that, because sometimes I borrow some of her pictures too, because she is a better photographer than I am. But, those are some helpful pointers.
I found my wife last year. I don't know where she got them from, maybe off my album. She created calendars for her mom and her aunt and for some of her family, and from some places that we had been, but pictures that I took. And I didn't see them until Christmas morning. They opened them up and like, wow, this is great. I'm like, sweet. I didn't know you made those, honey. That's awesome. But yeah, any kind of personal album is awesome. Doesn't matter if it's stunning photography or not.
I think, David, you were going to say something.
Yes,
David.
I was going to say something, which is it's on some. Can you all hear me? I guess not. You can. Anyway,
yeah.
Okay. What I was going to say was, unfortunately, I haven't been traveling much lately, but I try to tell a story too, but I don't share it online or anything like that. But maybe I will use Flickr or one of those other things. I used to a long time ago, but I don't anymore. And I use more than just an iPhone camera. I have a 35 millimeter camera that I use, and I just enjoy taking pictures. And I agree with you about one thing: you should never just walk up to a person and take their pictures. Always ask permission. I always do, and they never turn you down. They always say it's
happened to
okay.
me, but yeah.
It's okay. So, yeah, that's
And
it.
I would say too, for as far as sharing your pictures, share them with other people who are not photographers. Like, for the most part, if you get into photography forums online, they're just the worst people ever. Photographers just want to be critical of everybody's work rather than just, oh, hey, that's a cool photo. Tell me more about your trip.
So I used to belong to a photo club, but I quit because they focused on editing photos, basically, using Photoshop. And I say, I don't want to be by the computer. I want to be behind my camera.
Yep.
And composition is really what's important, So I quit the club because that's all they ever talked about.
Oh, it's too bad.
So,
Yeah, that's been my experience too, unfortunately.
Well, I see that Jen got off, but I was going to say she's a very lucky woman because I was married to a photographer and he just dragged me along. And there was many a time when I sat there for an hour while he tried to get like the perfect shot, and I was bored to tears and I couldn't wait for him to be done. So I think it's great that you're respectful of that because yeah, that can almost break a marriage there when you drag the wife or the husband along and make them sit there with you.
well, people don't realize how much effort it is to get a good photo. They see a good photo, they don't understand the photographer possibly stood there for 2-3 hours waiting for the light to be just right. So sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes you're in the middle of the day and you got what you got.
And that's why having compositional tools or just tips and tricks to use, especially with travel photography, is so important because you're only there for an hour. You can't come back tomorrow and come back the next day and wait for the light to be perfect. You got to make the most of whatever's in front of you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm going to leave now. Thank you.
Appreciate you guys coming.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks for chatting.
Thanks, Kaylee.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
See you
Have a
guys.
good night.